The gross margin can affect bottom line profits over time. The erosion in this margin can be caused by many things: rising costs, poor internal controls, or changes in the product mix. However, when it comes to an analysis of expenses, the primary cause for increases is the lack of internal control or follow-through on budgets. Expenses are not directly related to sales. Some overhead expenses accrue no matter what. So if sales fall from one year to the next, the expense of the long-term lease on the company's offices and warehouses continues at the same rate. If sales rise, the level of administrative salaries and wages should not rise dollar for dollar with sales. With higher volume, you expect such expenses to climb to a degree, but not dollar for dollar. So realistically, many general expenses such as salaries have to rise as sales revenue rises. In time, the company needs more space, more people, and more locations. The relationship between the revenue, cost, and expenses should reflect a tracking between sales and costs and a less reactive rise in general expenses. Expenses are broken down into two broad classifications. Sales expenses include the travel expenses of marketing and sales personnel, marketing department telephone and postage expenses, and similar kinds of sales-related items. However, sales expenses rise as sales rise, but not at the same rate as costs. The better-known general and administrative expenses, or simply overhead, are fairly fixed. You cannot expect administrative salaries, payroll taxes, rent, telephone, and insurance to change just because sales rise and fall. So the fixed nature of the general administrative expenses is its primary attribute. Of course, general and administrative expenses is going to rise as marketing activity increases, but proper internal control should help to keep such expenses in line. In fact, budgetary control over items such as office supplies, telephone, and postage is where managers can exert the greatest control and protect the bottom line net profit. One of the greatest dangers in this area is allowing overhead expenses to creep upward when profits are on the rise. Remember, however, that the tracking of net return, like gross margin, occurs on a percentage basis. The ideal trend in net profits contains several attributes. The dollar amount of expenses does not rise as quickly as revenue or costs. The purpose of separating direct costs from expenses is to track the changes from year to year. You need to ensure that direct costs remain steady and do not creep up as sales revenue rises. You also need to implement internal controls so that the percentage of expenses does not move upward more than necessary. Expenses rise more slowly in response to increased overhead demands, not in response to heightened sales volume. Expenses by definition should produce greater efficiency per revenue dollar as revenue levels rise. All too often you see the opposite in times of higher sales. If expenses rise as a percentage of sales, then the net return is also going to decline. Although the dollar amount of expenses rises, net profit should rise more. The net return percentage should remain consistent from year to year and should not fall. If it rises, that is a sign of efficiencies gained when revenue levels rise, but the net return should always remain the same as a minimum. Expenses outpacing revenue is a red flag. It means that management is not exerting control over expenses. The negative trend in expenses has an eroding effect on long-term profits. For this reason, organizations that end up going out of business often do so after a period of ever higher sales. They do not control cash flow or expenses. Successful companies know how important it is to hold expense level in check, especially when sales are moving upward rapidly.